Well, we've been in a series of messages on the 7 deadly sins. And today we come to the end of that series. And some of you are saying, good, it's about time. It's been hard dealing with these sins, facing these sins head on, because so many of us do struggle with these sins. That's why they're called the 7. There's many, many more sins than these 7, but these are the big ones that we all struggle with. So I've saved the worst for last. I should say the most difficult for last. The last sin today that we're going to look at is the sin of pride. What do we mean when we say pride? Just exactly what are we talking about? Well, the words in the Old Testament and the New Testament that refer to pride refer to something that is lifted up, exalting oneself, as seeing oneself as better than others, as surpassing them, as giving myself an undue degree of importance. You know, some of the words that we use for pride, some of the what we call synonyms would be like the word arrogant, haughty, conceited, pompous, egotistical. It's a person that has the swelling of the head. They have the big head. They have an exaggerated opinion of themselves. They think of themselves as more important than they really are. So pride really desires greatness. It wants to be great. And actually, when it's great, that's not enough. It wants to be greater than others around it. It wants to be at the top. It wants to be number one. Number one. I'm number one. Who was the first person that was tempted with that attitude, who was tempted to exalt himself? Obviously, it was Satan. He was one of the special angels in heaven. We call them cherubim, and he was the closest of the angels to God. He was nearest to the throne of God. So by his right, he was already great and important in heaven among all the other angels. But that wasn't enough for him. He couldn't be content with that. In Isaiah chapter 14, it says, and I believe this is referring to Satan, you said in your heart, this is Satan talking to himself before he became Satan, I will ascend to heaven above the stars of God. I will set my throne on high. I will sit on the mount of assembly in the far reaches on the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High. So it's been noted that pride is all about position and power. And that's what Satan wanted. He wanted a higher position. He wanted higher power than what God had given to him in heaven. Jesus talked about Satan in John chapter 8 and verse 44. And Jesus said this about Satan: he does not stand in the truth, because there is no truth in him. So Satan was not satisfied where God put him. He was not content to stay in that place. He was not willing to accept that he was in any way inferior to God, the Creator. He was not willing to be dependent on God and serve God in the place that God had placed him. And so he wanted the greatness that God had. He thought he could do that for himself. He could make that on his own, to be that person that everybody looks up to, just like they look up to God. And so he made the choice, based on pride, to rebel against God and not stand in that truth, the place where God put him. So we might think we would never be like that, but then look at our first parents. Look at what happened to Adam and Eve in the garden. You know, Satan came and tempted them with the very same temptation that he had. He tempted them that they could be like God, that if they ate from that tree of the knowledge of good and evil, then they would know, like God, good and evil, and they would be like God. Now we'd think, well, surely they would not give in to that. I mean, God says if you eat from this tree, you will die. You will lose spiritual life. You will lose physical life. But Eve, when she looked at that tree of the knowledge of good and evil, she didn't see it as a tree of death, because God says you'll die if you eat of it. She saw it as a tree of life that would give her life, that would put her in a better place. She looked at it to make her wise. Satan said, if you eat from this tree, you'll become like God. And when she looked at it, that's what she saw. And she gave into that temptation. Now, we're not to think because we're so spiritual, we're never going to be tempted with pride. We're not going to make the same mistake Satan did. We're not going to make the same mistake that our first parents did. But think about this for a moment. Satan was at the highest place in heaven of the angels. Adam and Eve were at the highest place on earth. They were the last ones that God made in his creation. They were the most privileged because God made them in his image so that they could have relationship with God. And yet, in the best place in heaven, in the best place on earth, they were at the top. And yet they both fell. They both gave in to the temptation to pride. And the issue is, as their children have the characteristics and the traits of the parents. So our first parents gave in to pride. It seems like we're going to have a temptation with pride. It seems like pride is going to be inbred in us. It's just going to be like natural to have this desire for greatness, this natural desire to want to be important, this natural desire that I'm up there and everybody takes notice of me. That's that pride that Satan felt, that pride that Adam and Eve felt, and everybody born after them has been a sinner. It's like we naturally gravitate to pride. So pride tells us to exalt ourselves. You're big. You're big. Everybody should look up to you. And then closely related to pride is vainglory. Vainglory. Sometimes we use those interchangeably, but really pride and vainglory are different sins. Vainglory is a child, a stepchild, we could say, of pride. But vainglory says, I want everybody to notice how great I am. Pride says, I want to be great. I want to exalt myself over everybody. Everybody look at me. I'm at the top. And vainglory says, take notice of me. Recognize me. Acclaim me. Give me applause. Recognize me for my greatness. And we have to realize that pride is often behind all the sins that we've looked at. Pride puts on many different faces, but it's still pride. So the sin of gluttony, the sin of lust, that's driven by pride. Pride is saying you should be able to do whatever you want. Nothing is off limits. If you want to do it, even though some people might think it's wrong, go ahead and do it. Go ahead and indulge yourself. That's pride. You have a craving. You are hungry for something. You want something. You know that how it's going to make you feel. Go ahead and do it. That's pride. And greed, pride says, you can never have enough. And you're deserving of it. You're deserving of everything that you want. And you're not happy enough if you get that, the thing that you're wanting more of, the greed, then that'll make you happy. Pride says you have a right to be angry. You haven't been recognized. You did all this and they didn't recognize you. Well, you should be angry about that. A person crossed you. You didn't get what you wanted with that person. Well, you have a right to be angry because of who you are. That's pride, speaking in our anger. Pride doesn't mind envying those who have more than it does because, after all, pride is at the top. And they shouldn't have those things, and I don't have them. I'm more important than them. I should be the ones who have those things. That's envy. And then pride doesn't mind being slothful. Slothful is that person who is I'm not really ambitious. I'm not really going after things. I'm not really trying to be productive and get a lot done. I'm just going to be lazy. Take it easy. And pride says, well, that's fine because you're already great. You can be satisfied with how great you are. You don't need to really work hard anymore. You're already great. So all these sins that we've looked at, pride is behind every one of them. I think when we introduced this series, we talked about the image of a tree. And the 7 deadly sins are like the branches of the tree. And the root of this tree and the main trunk of this tree is pride. Pride is the source. Pride is the source of it. It's the supply of it. It is feeding all of these sins. So that gives us an image of it, the evil root, egotism and pride, the main trunk there. So any one of us, no matter where we are, whether we're here in America, whether we're in Haiti, whether we're in Africa, no matter where we are in the world, no matter who the person is, every one of us can be tempted by pride. And we're here today, so we are considered religious people. So religious people, we should know better than to give in to the sin of pride when we're tempted by it. But Jesus observed that religious people especially are tempted by pride. If you have your Bibles in Matthew chapter 6, he says in verse 1, "Beware of practicing your righteousness before other people in order to be seen by them, for then you'll have no reward from your Father who is in heaven." Why are you practicing your righteousness? Why are you doing your religious observances? Is it because you love God? Is it because you're seeking God? No, he says they're doing it to be seen by others. He says that again in verse 5 when they pray. Why are they praying, standing in the streets and praying in the synagogues? That they may be seen by others. In verse 16, they're fasting. Why are they fasting? Why are they making their faces disfigured like they're hungry? He says it's to be seen by others. So Jesus said that we can be tempted when we go about doing our religious observances, our religious worship. Over in chapter 23 of Matthew, he notes this again, beginning in verse 5. He says, speaking of the religious leaders, the Pharisees, he says, "They do all their deeds to be seen by others, for they make their phylacteries broad and their fringes long, and they love the place of honor at feasts and the best seats in the synagogues and greetings in the marketplaces and being called rabbi," that means teacher, by others. So why are they doing all this? Why do they want to be known by the people as so good, so upright, so religious, so pious? You know, they're going way over the top. It's all about their love for God? No, he says it's all about to be seen by others, so other people will think that they're great, so they will be lifted up, so they're surpassing everybody else. In his book Confessions, St. Augustine shares about when he was a teenager and he was hanging around with some of his friends, and they really didn't have anything to do, so they decided that they were going to go steal some fruit from their neighbor's pear trees. They were going to go get a bunch of fruit just for the fun of it. I mean, they weren't hungry. They didn't need the fruit. I mean, after they stole it, they went and they threw the pears to a bunch of pigs. It's like, that sounds like youth, foolish youth when they're not supervised. But as he reflected back on that, he says, why did I do that? He says, I did it to impress my friends. I did it so they would look up to me and think that I was something. He talks about later when he was in school, he said, I was motivated to get the best grades in school. I was motivated to be the best, to be at the very top. I was motivated to be the very best speaker so that I could go on to wow everybody. I wanted to get that job like what we call lawyer. He says, I wanted to go in there in court and wow everybody. They say, wow, he is so impressive. I mean, nobody is so eloquent, nobody makes arguments like he does. He says, I wasn't about giving justice to the person I was defending. It was about so I would impress everybody. So they would look up to me and say, he is the greatest speaker we've ever heard. Jesus points out the motivation of these religious leaders again in John 12, verse 43. He says they love the glory that comes from men. They love the glory, the praises that come from men, rather than the glory that comes from God. It's all about pride. It's all about, look at me. I am great. I'm important. I've surpassed everybody else. Now, we can know we've been taken over by pride when how we look at others that are different from us. Look in Luke chapter 18. Here we have a story that Jesus told about two men that went up to the temple to pray. One was a Pharisee, and the other was a tax collector. And the tax collectors were working for the Roman government. They were despised by the Jews. They would rip people off and charge more than they should have charged. He said, he also told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and treated others with contempt. He says, 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, prayed thus, God, I thank you that I am not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I get. So this Pharisee, he was a man who was very devoted to God. He was very devoted to following the law. He was all about doing it to the nth degree, being committed to God. And so you look at his life and it was impeccable. There was nothing wrong or out of order in his life. You could follow him around and not find anything that was off in his life. And so he has this prayer, and you can tell the attitude of his prayer, there is an attitude of superiority that is coming from him. He thought he was better than this tax collector. He looks over there at this tax collector and says, I'm glad I'm not like that guy. You know, I'm a lot better than that guy. Maybe he's praying through these things. He's thinking, well, maybe the tax collector is guilty of all these things, but Lord, I'm not. And obviously God should hear my prayer because I am the one who is walking according to the law and I'm a righteous man. I remember when we were at another church out in Colorado Springs, we had a vacation Bible school for the week. And I was going over to the church and I noticed a guy sitting on the steps, and to me he looked like he was maybe a gangbanger. Just the appearance of him, and I just thought to myself, oh boy. You know, he must have dropped his kids off for vacation Bible school, or he is a homeless guy looking for a handout. And maybe this is an opportunity for me to go and share the Lord with him and have a chance to give him a Christian testimony. So I go up and I approach him, and the closer I get, I notice that he is wearing a Christian t-shirt. I'm thinking to myself, what? This can't be. And I go and we start talking, and he's obviously somebody who professes to know the Lord. The Lord is in his life. And I'm asking myself afterwards, why did I judge him like that? Why am I thinking he's not a Christian and I'm probably better than he is and he needs the Lord? I have the Lord. Yeah, look at me. It's because we look at things on the outside. We judge on the outside. Like it was said that we judge on the outside, but God judges on the heart. God knows the heart. God knows what that person is really like. And here this Pharisee thinks that he is so much better than this tax collector because look on the outside. Look at his life. His life looks so religious, so close to God. And look at that tax collector. Obviously, he is not. But Jesus continues the story in verse 13. But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even lift up his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself, that's pride, will be humbled. But the one who humbles himself will be exalted. So if you put your money that day, said, hey, let's do a bet. Let's do $100 on which of these guys gets their prayer answered. $100 on the Pharisee, he gets his prayer answered, or $100 on the tax collector. You'd put your money on the Pharisee, wouldn't you? He's the one that looks like he's going to get his prayers answered that day. But who was the one that got their prayers answered? It was not the tax, it was the tax collector. Even though he didn't look like much on the outside, because he had the right kind of attitude with God. He had an attitude, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. Like envy, pride is making comparisons and noting the differences. Now, let's look at this Pharisee a little bit more. Did you pick up on his attitude in this story? Not only did he have a disdain for this, what we might call this scumbag of a tax collector, but he also had his self-righteous attitude. Who does he give the credit to for his upright life? Who does he give the credit to for his moral life, living the way we're supposed to? Did you notice what he said? I thank you, so he's thankful, that's good, that I am not like other men. And he lists all these sins. I fast, I give tithes. It's all about I. I'm the one that's responsible for this. I'm the one that's put in the hard work. I'm the one that fasts twice a week. I'm not a glutton. I discipline my body. I'm the one who gives a tithe of all that I get. I'm not greedy. I give away my money. I don't sin with gluttony. I don't sin with greed. I'm putting all this effort into being a moral religious person. He's giving himself the credit. He's giving himself all the adulation. So that's what pride does. Pride likes to be in the limelight. Pride says, look at me. Look at who I am. Look at what I've done. Give all your attention to me. Give the applause to me. But the person who is truly humble is like Paul over in 1 Corinthians 15, beginning in verse 9. Paul here says, "For I am the least of the apostles, unworthy to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. But by the grace of God I am what I am, and his grace toward me was not in vain. On the contrary, I worked harder than any of them, though it was not I, but the grace of God that is with me." So Paul seems to be bragging a little bit. He says, I worked harder than all of the other apostles. That's quite a statement. I worked harder than Peter. I worked harder than John and James and all of the apostles. I mean, I outdid all of them. I am so much greater than them, right? He says, no. He says, it wasn't me. He said, I am the least of the apostles. So he doesn't take any credit for what he did. The credit all goes to the Lord. The Lord is the one who worked in me so that I would do this. He chalks it up to God, empowering him to serve the way he did, and he surpassed all of the other apostles. You know, one of the problems with pride is it is a glory robber. Pride is a thief. It steals the glory that belongs to God and takes it for itself. Pride wants the praise. Pride wants to be important. Just as important as God is. That's what Satan's attitude was. I want to be just as important as God is in heaven. Pride wants to feel good about itself. And that's pride. Look at me. Look at what I've done. But who is it that works in the heart? Who was it that worked in the heart of this Pharisee? That he was not the way of the tax collector. It was God at work in his heart, giving him that desire to live that kind of life. And that's what Paul says. It was God that worked in me. He says, I wouldn't be this kind of person if God in his grace hadn't come to me and changed my heart. Because Paul was exactly like that self-righteous Pharisee in Luke chapter 18 until God stopped him on the road to Damascus. You know, the other thing about pride is that pride will tempt you to be a hypocrite. You know, what happens when you get your self-esteem, when you get your feeling of self-worth about yourself, you get that from maybe your religious devotion, how other people look up to you because you are such a devout person, you are so religious. And then you realize there's a gap between what people think of me, maybe the way I am at church, or the way I am in my Bible study, and the way I really am in my life, the way I really am in my heart. There is a big gap between the two. The two are not the same. My life is inconsistent with my persona, how people perceive me at church. Look at what Jesus said over in Matthew 23 and 25. This is one of the most scathing sermons that Jesus gave, and it was denouncing the religious leaders of his day, the Pharisees. And 6 times in this sermon, he calls them hypocrites. How would you like if somebody came up to your face and said, you hypocrite? I mean, that would be an insult. And that's what Jesus is saying here, you hypocrites. And he says in verse 25, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you clean the outside of the cup and the plate, but inside they are full of greed and self-indulgence. Would you say those are 2 sins? I would. So they had everybody fooled. They had everybody thinking that they were so good, that they were so holy and so righteous. And he says, on the inside, you are full of greed. You're not content with what God has given you. You're not doing what you do out of love. So pride will tempt you to hypocrisy. Well, I don't want to admit that I'm not living right. I don't want to admit to others that I'm falling short in these areas, because if I do that, then they won't look up to me, because I'll lose that respect. I'll lose that status. So pride will tempt you to continue to live with that inconsistency in your life and not admit, you know what, I'm a sinner. I fall short. I struggle. At times I am a gluttonous. At times I do lust. At times I do have greed. At times, and we just go through the list of sins. Yeah, I'm there at times. I struggle with that. But pride says, no, you shouldn't say any of that, because then people will not look up to you. People will not respect you for who they think you are. So all of us are going to be tempted with pride. And sometimes pride is the most difficult of the sins to detect in our lives, because it does a really good job of deceiving us and making us feel good. So obviously God does not want this sin to be in our lives. So how do we put an end to pride? We go back to the book of Proverbs. Has a lot to say about pride and our attitude with God. It says in Proverbs chapter 6 and verse 16, it says, there are 6 things that the Lord hates, 7 that are abomination to him. And the very first one is haughty eyes. That's pride, haughtiness. Look at me. Look at how great I am. I'm better than everybody else. I deserve your respect and admiration. Haughty eyes. God hates that. In Proverbs 16:5, it says, everyone who is arrogant in heart. That's a heart that is lifted up in its self-importance, its greatness. Look at me, I'm better. What does it say? Is an abomination to the Lord. Be assured he will not go unpunished. So God makes it clear in his word that this is a sin that he hates. And so should we. And God warns us what will happen if we are a proud person, if we have given in to pride and we remain that proud person. He warns us in Proverbs 16:18, pride goes before destruction and a haughty spirit before a fall. You're setting yourself up for a fall if you become full of pride. So it's obvious from these verses that God takes this sin seriously, and so should we. He says in James 4:6, and he's quoting here from Proverbs 3:34, but he gives more grace. Therefore, he says, God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Now, he's also talking to believers here who become proud. He opposes the proud. That is a really strong word. It's actually a military word. To stand your ground, to resist, to fight against that person that is your enemy. That's what God says about us when we become proud. He opposes us. You said, I thought God was for me. Why would God be against me? Because of pride. God wants to destroy pride in our lives. And sometimes when he's doing that, we think he's actually destroying our very lives. But he wants to get pride out of our lives. And so he must oppose us and fight against us when it becomes part of our lives. So Proverbs gives this practical counsel on overcoming pride. In Proverbs 3:7, it says, be not wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and turn away from evil. In other words, don't overestimate yourself and your abilities. Pride will tempt you to think that you don't need the Lord. You got this. You don't need to listen to him and follow what he's asking you to do and live according to his ways. Pride will say, you don't need that. You're smart enough. You're wise enough. You can figure things out. You don't need the Lord to get to where you need to be. That sounds like Satan. You don't need God to be important to reach your highest potential. In Proverbs 27:2, it says, let another praise you and not your own mouth, a stranger and not your own lips. So don't praise yourself. I don't know if anybody is filling out a resume right now looking for another job. It's kind of hard to follow that verse, right? On the resume, you have to show your great qualities and what a great guy you are and why they should hire you. But he says, do not praise yourself. No, pride wants to puff itself up. Pride wants to boast. Pride wants to brag. Look at me. Look at how great I am. Or, if you're too embarrassed to do that, pride will tempt you in your mind to imagine yourself as becoming that great person and doing those great things, and everybody wants to look at you and say, wow, look at you. That's pride. He says, don't let yourself do that. Don't praise yourself. Don't imagine great things for yourself. And when you hear praise, it can be a temptation to pride. He says in Proverbs 27:21, the crucible is for silver, and the furnace is for gold, and a man is tested by his praise. So how will you respond when you are praised? Pride will use it to make you think you're really important. See, I told you, you are the best. You are the most important here. You are the greatest. I mean, finally, right? They finally figured it out. You knew it all along. When praise comes, then comes a temptation to pride. In the Desert Fathers, there is a story of a believer who came to a man named Macarius. He was one of the Desert Fathers that was looked up to. He said to Macarius, give me a word. And Macarius said, I want you to go down to the cemetery and I want you to insult the dead. Oh, it's not the word I expected. So he goes down to the cemetery, standing there by himself looking at these tombstones, and so he begins to do that. He begins to insult the dead. He begins to call them derogatory and demeaning names. And he looks around, no response, so he picks up some stones and he starts throwing stones at the tombstones. No response. So he goes back to Macarius, and Macarius said, did you go down there and do that? He says, yes, I did. He said, did they say anything to you? And he said, no. Okay, well, let's try this. Go back, and I want you just to praise them. So the man goes back down to the cemetery, and so he begins to call them holy men of God, righteous, devout, wonderful. Silence. So he goes back to Macarius, and he says, so what did they say back to you when you praised them? And he said, not a word. So Macarius said, here is the word. You know how you insulted them and they did not respond back to you, and how you praised them and they did not say anything to you? He says, so too, if you wish to be delivered from sin, you must do the same and become a dead man. Like the dead, take no account of either the scorn of men or their praises. So how do we do that? You get praise. You're living your life for the Lord, and people are noticing that. You're doing good works, and it's making a difference. Didn't Jesus say that? He said, let your light shine before men, that they may see your good works. And then here's the fine line. They see your good works so that I may be seen by them and lifted up. Now, that's what the Pharisees did. That's what the religious leaders did back in Matthew chapter 6. They did all these good works to be seen by others. He said, no, so that your Father in heaven may be glorified. See, the praise comes. What do I do with that praise? Where does that praise go? It's deflected from me to the one who worked on my heart to give me the desire to do those good works. That's what Paul talks about in Philippians chapter 2. He says, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God who works in you both to will and to work for His good pleasure. This points back to what Paul said earlier. I was the least of the apostles, but I worked harder than everybody else. Why? Because of God's grace in my life. God worked in my heart. That's why I did those things. I have an uncle that passed away a few years ago. And when he was in high school going through, he was quite an athlete in all the sports. And the story goes the New York Yankees were interested in him and trying to recruit him. But he felt a call of God on his life to serve the Lord. So he went off to a Christian college. And in one of the basketball games there, he scored a record number of points. I don't know exactly what it was. I think it was like 66 or 68 points in one game. He set the school record. And his friend came up to him after the game and said, "Ken, don't let it go to your head. 1 Corinthians 10:31, whether you eat or drink or whatever you do all to the glory of God." And my uncle went on to start a Christian camp called the Wilds. And what he put in place at the Wilds is every morning, every meal, breakfast, lunch, supper, the campers all recited 1 Corinthians 10:31 before the prayer. Whether therefore you eat or drink or whatever you do, score 68 points in a basketball game. And by the way, I would hang out with him, and he loved sports, and we would go down and we'd play one-on-one. And here he's probably, at the time, 40 years older than me. Maybe put that to 30 years. So we'd play one-on-one. I'd say, "No problem, I got this guy. You know, I'm 4 inches taller than him. I can jam over him, whatever." He would take me down on the left side, and he would put out his elbow, and he'd do his sky hook. I couldn't block it. I mean, he'd just drain the points. He was so good. But every day at camp, whether therefore you eat or drink or whatever you do, Ken was blessed by God with all kinds of talent. Not just sports talent, but he was an incredible Christian leader. And yet he wanted the glory to go to God. You know, that's what Jesus is saying. Your good works, so that they may glorify your Father in heaven. When you're praised, the praise goes to God. God is the one that allowed me to do that. God was the one that gave me that ability, that gave me that opportunity, whatever it was. It goes to God and not to self. The Desert Fathers counseled people who struggled with pride to do this one thing. Now, I know you're probably thinking, well, we need to be humble, and we do. So just learn how to humble yourself. And I would say, you know, if you do humble yourself and say, "I'm nothing, here I want to serve others," that's what a true humble servant does, is they serve others and they help others, they think of others. But the problem with that is when you go and you serve other people, and then pride will say, "You're such a good servant. There's probably nobody else here is as good a servant as you are. Boy, they should be recognizing you around here as good of a servant." See, no matter what we do, pride is going to come knocking at the door and say, "Lift yourself up, exalt yourself. You're great, you're important. Everybody should recognize it." So the Desert Fathers counseled people this one thing you should do. You should go to be by yourself where it's quiet and you can think and pray, to a solitary place, and ask yourself questions. Examine your heart. Why is it that you are exalting yourself? Why is it that you are looking at yourself as better than others? Why are you imagining great things for yourself? Why do you need to strive for positions of power and honor for yourself? Why do you need to be praised and affirmed? Why do you need to feel significant and important? Why are you not content with your place in life? Those are really heart-searching questions. They get to the bottom of pride. You know, pride cannot bear to feel little, to be insignificant, to be unimportant, unnoticed, overlooked, or even unappreciated. William James is considered by some as the father of psychology here in America. He was the first educator to offer a course in psychology in America. I found that interesting. He said that the craving to be appreciated is a deep need in human nature. A deep need in human nature. That was his observation. I would say that's true. Most people want to be appreciated and noticed as important. But what might seem to be a deep and normal need in our human hearts can be used by Satan as a fall into the sin of pride. Now, the world will tempt us. It will tempt us to get our self-worth and our identity from our status, from our place of power, from our position, from the honor that we want in life, from being noticed and admired, but we will never be satisfied with that. Satan was at the highest level of the angels, And he wasn't satisfied with that. Adam and Eve were at the highest level of God's creation on earth, and they weren't satisfied with that. I love what St. Augustine said. God has made us for himself, and our hearts are restless until we rest in him. You see, the sin of pride cuts off our relationship with God. Rather than trust God and depend on him, we want to take things into our own hands. We want to be the one who is in control and decide for ourselves. Like Adam and Eve, we want to take from the tree of knowledge of good and evil and decide for ourselves what's right, what's the best path for our lives to make our lives the best they can be, instead of letting God show us and follow him from his word. We were made for a relationship with God, but pride cuts off that relationship. And that's not what God wants for us. As believers, we do need meaning and purpose for our lives, but we must not look to meet those needs through the world. We must not base our self-worth and our identity on the world, how the world says you get prestige and honor and greatness. Comparison games. No, we're going to stop playing those comparison games. We're going to stop imagining in our minds of greatness for ourselves. If we are to be done with pride, I think this is so counterintuitive, and you're going to think, no, he's just waxing on. But I want you to think about this. If we are to be done with pride, we must learn to rest in God's love for us, an unconditional love that loves us no matter what, whether it's a good day, whether it's a bad day. Those days that we don't measure up and we fall short of where we need to be. His love does not stop on those days. His love does not restart on those days where we are measuring up. No, God's love is unconditional for us. He loves us regardless of whether or not we attain a place of greatness and honor and status and prestige and all that. He loves us regardless. Those things are not important to God. What is important to God is our hearts. If our hearts desire him, if our hearts want him, if our hearts are accepting his love and resting in his love for us. His love, resting in that. His love is more than enough for us. We don't need that pride. His love will always be more than enough for us. I don't have to play the comparison game that I'm better than somebody so I can be proud about myself. No, I don't have to do that because God's made us different and because God loves them just as much as he loves me. So when we have learned to accept and rest in his love, then we will be able to say to pride, "Pride, you are not welcomed here. You are no friend of mine. Get behind me, Satan." Listen to the words of Jeremiah. Thus says the Lord, "Let not the wise man boast in his wisdom. Let not the wise man boast, the mighty man boast in his might. Let not the rich man boast in his riches, but let him who boasts boast in this, that he understands and knows me, that I am the Lord who practices who practices steadfast love, justice, and righteousness in the earth. For in these things I delight, declares the Lord." Let's pray.